Hi everyone and welcome to another video. I'm Lauren and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about what my reading has been like for the past couple of weeks. So we're going to talk about August and like the beginning of September. I took a bit of a hiatus, a bit of a... Can you take a hiatus? I don't think so. But I took a little bit of a break from BookTube. I was watching some videos but not necessarily commenting, and while I was thinking a little bit for myself about content, at no point was there anything that I really felt like sitting down to film. And one of the reasons for that is that I was reading bigger books, so I wasn't finishing a lot, and therefore I really didn't have a lot to talk about. The big books that I have been reading, I'm still reading. I'm hoping to finish... I'm going to finish them definitely somewhere in September, so you're gonna see me talk about them more in my September wrap-up. One is The Tomb of Sand by Gitanjani Shri, and it's been translated by Daisy Rockwell. So this is the winner of the International Booker. I have 100 pages left, maybe less, so I really wish I finished this one somewhere this week, but I also thought that I was gonna finish it last weekend, so we shall see. But I'm enjoying this one, and if I don't talk about it in my September wrap-up, then I'll talk about it in a separate Invisible Cities Reading Around the World video, because I also read this for Invisible Cities. But as you can see, bigger book that I'm taking my time with. Let's put it here. Does that work? It's gonna fall, isn't it? The other chunkster that I'm reading, bigger than that one, is War and Peace. So I have got this copy in French. They're split up into these two volumes, both 1,000 pages, so that makes up for a total of 2,000 pages. I finished the first book at the end of September, and I think I have a little bit less than half the second left to go now. I'm reading this one for my book club, and again, you'll see me talk about this one in the wrap up for September, but this one has been taking me a while. It is a big one. I did finish two other books. Is this gonna work this time? No, it's not gonna work. Let me just push the book away. There, that's better. There are two books that I did finish in August. One, I really didn't have a lot left. I'd already been reading it for what comes before August, July, maybe even June. And that is Revolusi by David van Reyenbrouck. You might have heard me talk about it in other videos. So this is a non-fiction book about Indonesian, written by a Belgian historian. I was very keen to get to this one because it got some very good reviews, and Indonesia was also one of the countries that was picked for Invisible Cities. Now, this is not written by an Indonesian writer, so I'm not counting it for my Reading Around the World or Invisible Cities or whatever, but I still found it fascinating. So in case you didn't know, in the past, the Netherlands had colonized Indonesia, and that's not a part of history that a lot of attention is brought on, but now that it's been a couple of decades, it's become more of a subject, and we're talking more here in the Netherlands, the country that I'm living in, about some of the war crimes and stuff like that. And in this book, David van Reyenbrouck talks about the history of Indonesia before they got colonized from the Netherlands a little bit. He talks about, because it's such a huge country, where different people came from and the different religions and languages and cultures and stuff like that. But it really starts when the Netherlands and also other Western countries become interested in some of the islands that are now part of Indonesia, and because of the different spices or the rubber that could be found in different places. And he describes how we went from being interested in the products and buying them to claiming some parts of the land, to saying whole pieces of land were Dutch, for example. And then he moves on to how the Netherlands took over more and more land, how they did that, how the Indonesian people were reacting. There were a couple of tries to have independence, or at least be allowed to have more rights as Indonesian people, and how the culture of Indonesia came to be a little bit more of a whole, how the idea that all of the islands that are now part of Indonesia, how they came to feel as being part of the same group. He talks about Japan and the Second World War taking over all of the islands, and then after the Japanese left, how the revolution and the war for independence happened between Indonesia and the Netherlands. So it spans rather a long piece of time, and I actually missed, because you stay with Indonesia for such a long time, because you don't, I kind of missed the recent history. I was so invested, I want to know more about this country. So I kind of missed the recent history part, but this was a very, very good read. He did a ton of research, and one of the special things that David from Reyenbrouck did, and one of the reasons that I was also interested in reading it, was that he went to talk to the people that were alive, for example, during the Japanese period, and to really learn what life was like for different people in Indonesia, in different places and with different backgrounds. And he weaves these stories of these people throughout the macro historical perspective that he's also showing. He also talks about how Indonesia is the first, or if not the first, then one of the first countries to claim their independence after the Second World War, and the impact that that had on other countries. And he weaves that really macro, big historical timeline with, you know, someone that is there that was initially happy that the Japanese were there because at least they were Asian, and then being hungry and then turning their back against the Japanese. So it's more like the history on the ground, and I thought that the way he plays with all of these different parts of the history very well. His voice is also interesting. It cycles through a couple of times, and it makes it just a little bit, maybe not personal, but this book is so far from dry for a history book. It was fascinating. There was not a part that I thought, this is taking long. There's even little parts of history that he talks about that are not well known, not necessarily from the West, but overall. So he talks about a group of fighters from the British Army that were actually from Nepal, and their role in the war and their role in the British Army during the Second World War. So that was also interesting. I think they're called Gurkhas, out of the top of my head. So fascinating book. I will say one negative that I have is that I'm a Western reader, so I'm still I have, because of where I'm raised, certain prejudices, maybe not prejudices, but I have a certain way of seeing the colonial history, and I was curious to see how David from Reyenbrouck, being Belgium and also being part of this Western world, how that would also cycle through in this book. I mean, he does a very good job of looking at the voices of the people that were there, but there were still ways in which even I as a Western reader could see that there was a lot of focus on the Dutch and on the Dutch point of view of things, and less focus on the nuances in the Indonesian point of view about certain subjects. So for example, one of the big things that we talk about in the Netherlands now is the war crimes that happened during the revolution itself. And those war crimes happened on the Dutch side and on the Indonesian side, well, on all sides, because Dutch and Indonesian is a very black and white way of putting it. And he talks about how those war crimes were systematic and how we viewed them, and how it's only now that we're talking about them, and how they were pushed away, and etc, etc, etc. And when it comes to the Indonesian war crimes, the only thing that he says is, well, Indonesia really wanted to focus on the future and were really happy that they were finally independent, though they never looked back on the war crimes. And that seems like a very black and white way of putting it. I don't believe that it is that it's that easy, and I would have wished for a little bit more of point of views, of way of, maybe if everybody does look to the future, not the past, but I still think there would probably be, but different groups in the Indonesian society will feel differently about that future, will feel differently about the Japanese period, will feel differently about the War of Independence. So That I missed, so I would still really like to read a book that is written by an Indonesian historian, but for now this was such a good, for me that did not know a lot / anything from that period, this was such a good basis. It was simultaneously very well explained for someone who didn't know, and I also think it has a lot of information that is interesting for someone that has more knowledge about that time and period. So that's Revolusi. I don't think it's been translated to anything but Dutch, but if it is at one point, I would recommend you looking into it because of the way it presents history mostly. So yeah, that's Revolusi. If you're Dutch, I would really, really recommend reading it. It is a great, great book. The other book that I read is one that is a lot more well known in BookTube and the English reading community, and that is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. So I have previously already read this one. I think it came out in 2016, 2018, somewhere along those lines, 2017. And I think I must have read it in 2018, maybe 2019. So around the time when it came out and when everybody was raving about it here on BookTube. So this is historical fiction and a family saga. We meet a young woman called Sunja, and she... when she's young, so she's Korean, she lives in Korea with her mother who has a boarding house. They are not very rich, but they're very hardworking, and she falls in love with the man. He is becoming richer and richer. He works in Japan but goes back to Korea on business. He's from Jeju originally, and he gets her pregnant. Now, apparently, it turns out that he has a wife, and he would still like to take care of Sunja and the child, but she realizes that if she does that, she'll become a pariah of the society, and it's not really something that she wants. Luckily for her, a man that at that point stays at the boarding house decides that he will help her, and he will marry her and take care of the child as if it's their own, and they are going to move to Japan together. He was already planning on moving to Japan, and from then on we follow mostly Sunja, but also the family that she marries into, and her children and her children's children while they live in Japan, and they live through the Second World War and what comes after and what is before. So that's Pachinko in a nutshell. It's a book that is very clearly written, and I haven't really met anyone that didn't like it, not to say didn't love it. It was a great book also to discuss with a book club, which is how I read it again, why I read it again. Initially I was a little bit afraid. I didn't really see, it's not a book that has a lot of layers or things that you can view very differently, but still, because there are so many characters and because they go through a lot, we did end up still talking for the whole evening, and we were not really done talking when we were out of time. But on a reread, what I noticed is that this is not a book where the second time you will notice a lot of different things. What you get from it the first time is really a lot of what it is, and I don't think that has to do with my reading already being at the point that it is now when I read it. I really think this is the book that is just one that is very good for a lot of people. Another thing that I noticed now on a reread is that it's really a book that is written from the point of view of someone that was raised in the West, and also for Western readers. It explains little things that an author that is from there and that writes for their own people, so in this case for Korean or Japanese, would not take time to explain. And apparently, but that's not something that I can testify to because I'm not either Korean or Japanese, but apparently there are also a few things in the way some characters call one another that in the book were like Korean or Japanese. That is not how it would actually have been done, so apparently it's not 100% correct. So you do kind of notice that, but I don't think it's a very big it's for most readers it won't necessarily be a problem, but I've noticed for myself that it's something that I now look for more in books than I used to. And it also made me think that maybe I think if you change just a couple of things in the book, it could have been placed in a different time and in a different place and you wouldn't necessarily notice. So one of the big things in the books is the way the Japanese treat the Koreans and the position of Korean women within the Korean society, or of women in general within the society. But I didn't get the impression that a lot of these things were very prevalent. The details that were in the book were very prevalent to Japan, Korea, or that period in time. I don't think that the examples were not nuanced enough. They were so similar to the way that in the Netherlands we treat Moroccans as a whole, or in France Algerians are treated, and it didn't show very specific examples of how Japanese in particular do that to Koreans in particular. I missed that kind of depth. That would be so interesting, and in that sense it didn't really have a very strong sense of place and time, not a very thorough, I would say. It's still clearly Japanese and still clearly Korean, but I missed, like for example, I recently read The Death of Vivek Oji, and that one, it felt so much like I was learning a lot about what it is to actually be in Nigeria, and not in a, oh, there were these kind of clothes, but really in the relationships between people in a family, and I had a lesson in this book. Anyway, I'm gonna stop rambling about it. It was still very enjoyable, in case I didn't say it. But they're just little things that now I notice a little bit more. Anyway, that was Pachinko. So those were the two books that I ended up only finishing in August. Now for the month of September, as I said, I'm going to finish The Tomb of Sand and War and Peace. And I'm also hoping to read some shorter books because of Shorty September. But I've been having that idea in my head since halfway through August, and I haven't even touched a short book. So we're gonna have to see whether I'm gonna end up doing that. But I would love to read some shorter books also in September, but you'll have to see in my September wrap-up when the time is there for that, whether I succeeded. That's it for now. I am going to stop talking, and I'll see you in another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Ba-chum, ba-chum, chum.